There is an island in the Indian Ocean where an invasive species of yellow crazy ants, which is the insect on the left, have formed super colonies. They're not native to this island. This island once had 100 million red land crabs on it during their annual migration. That's the picture on the right. It was covered with these little red crabs. And they lived quite harmoniously and they had their niche. But these yellow crazy ants were brought by human beings, and now they are decimating the red crabs. They do it in a gruesome way, in case you want to know. It's like a Nature Channel thing. They blind them and then eat them alive. You don't want to know. So anyway, it's not cool. But that's not the only island where this is happening. On the island of Midway, the albatross population has almost completely been wiped out by house mice. On Australia, a much bigger island, but still an island, the island of Australia, famously, rabbits were let free about 100 years ago. And then millions upon millions of rabbits descended on that small continent, overgrazed the grass, and caused massive erosion. They can't get rid of the things. They can't get them under control. They've tried. The point of being, of course, that these isolated ecosystems, islands in particular, are extremely vulnerable to an outside force, to something coming in there and decimating the balance and ruining it. And I thought that was a good analogy to what Paul is talking about here today, because on these islands, if you don't get rid of all the mice or the snake or the rabbits or whatever the thing is, maybe you get rid of all but a couple. You know what's going to happen a couple years later? They're all going to be back, because they've got no natural predator. There's nothing getting rid of them naturally. They have to be completely eradicated or they'll just come back. And I thought that was a good way to make an analogy for what we're talking about here today in Colossians 3, starting with verse 5, and I think you'll see the point. It says this: "Put to death, therefore, whatever belongs to your earthly nature, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, and greed, which is idolatry." I'll start with the therefore. That therefore reminds us that this is connected to what Paul just said. And if you were here last week and you remember, we talked about setting our hearts and our minds on things above, on elevating and to the spiritual realm our hearts and our minds in imitation of God. And in order to do that, we need to do this as well. These are two parts of the same process. You cannot simply say, I'm going to focus on heavenly things, I'm going to set my heart and my mind there, and then have this stuff happening at the same time. They're antithetical. They work against each other. And so Paul says, if you're going to set your heart and your mind on things above, which you need to do, the next thing, and connected to it, you also need to put to death these things. Now, put to death is no small phrase. Paul could have said you need to control them. He could have said you need to manage them, minimize them. But he didn't. He said put them to death, eradicate them, eliminate them, kill them, destroy them, get rid of these things. Because if you keep a little bit around, it'll come back. You need to get rid of it and entirely eliminate it. Paul says you need to eliminate whatever belongs to your earthly nature. He's going to list a few things, and later on in verse 8 he'll list a few more things, but we know that his list is not exhaustive. It couldn't possibly be exhausted because the ways in which human beings have rebelled and sinned against God are extremely numerous. They fall into some broad categories, and Paul's going to touch on some of those. But we know that this is not an exhaustive list. The point being, if what Paul is describing here in your own life, in your own heart, if it belongs to that earthly nature, it needs to go. Whether Paul listed it specifically or not, it still needs to be eliminated. That earthly nature is that part of us that is in rebellion against God, that part of us that is self-centered, proud, willful, the part that's out of control. It needs to be eliminated, and it's because it is the opposite of being Christ-like. An analogy occurred to me. I don't know how many of you have seen the show Hoarders. You ever see an episode of the show Hoarders? They go into someone's house, and in some cases, piled to the ceiling are piles of junk. Some people hoard things nice and neatly, but most of the hoarders, they also have garbage in there. And so the bottom of their house is now infested with vermin, with rats, with lice and bugs, because there's things decaying and rotting there. In order to clean that house, everything has to be taken out. You can't just take half the layer down and say, well, we made progress. Maybe you filled 4 dumpsters full of junk, but if you didn't get all the way down to the bottom, it's not fixing the problem. If you leave some of the trash, then you still have an issue. It's amazing what they do on that show with, hazmat suits and whatnot. They literally take everything but that's not nailed down out, because it all has to go. It's all been ruined and destroyed by these habits. That's an amazing analogy, I think, for what Paul is saying here. He's saying if you've got junk, trash, refuse in your heart or in your mind, such as the ones he's listing here, it needs to go. How can we clean? How can we make it sanitary and livable and proper when that trash is still on the floor? You can't. It's impossible. So Paul says, eliminate it, put it to death, get rid of it. And then he lists some of them. The first 3, sexual immorality, impurity, lust, are roughly grouped together. That's making reference to the whole spectrum of sexuality that rejects God's commands. The command of God regarding our sexuality, simply put, abstinence before marriage and monogamy after. That is what God has commanded, and there is a whole range of things that human beings do in order to go against that. A whole range of attitudes that treat sex and our sexuality as a means to an end, as something that is there to please me and me alone, and therefore other people and other institutions and the rules. They all don't matter because it's all about me. And that, of course, is the problem. There are a massive amount of actions associated with that self-centered passion. The misuse of it is exceedingly prevalent in our world today. So much so that that which was a gift from God, our sexuality, is now abused in ways both mundane that people don't even notice because it's so common, and ways that still have the power to revolt us with their cruelty. Paul says, get rid of all that. You don't need it. Paul says you also need to get rid of your evil desires, which is a pretty generic phrase. We certainly know that there is, as Solomon said, nothing new under the sun. Every sin that is being committed in our world today has been committed by our forefathers and by their forefathers. None of this rebellion against God is new. Every new generation contemplates anew how it can defy God, how it can rebel against the law of God, how it can assert its own will at the expense of other people. And then he ends the list with one that I think is very commonplace, very overlooked in society, and that is greed. People do not realize, I don't think, how upsetting to God our greed really is. Paul here calls it idolatry. And that might not strike a chord with us, but it certainly would have in the first century. Because idolatry was one of those things that if you read the Old Testament, the people of Israel struggled mightily with getting rid of idolatry. It was a problem that the prophets confronted again and again and again, because it showed a divided loyalty. It showed that you were not wholly devoted to God. You had something else on the side. And so Paul calls our greed a form of idolatry. And I think we understand that when we place things, created things, objects, when they become more important to us, not than just other people, which would be bad enough, but more important to us than God, what can it be but idolatry? And what a sad trade that would be. Trading God, who created you, redeems us, sustains us, for things, items, objects, none of which can hold a candle in true value to God. And yet people, time and time again, in their greed, put things above God, let alone above their family, their loved ones, the other people they should be responsible for. Amazing, in our world today, some of those things aren't even real. They don't even have actual existence. They only exist in the cloud, which are, a generation ago, you would really confuse people if you said it exists in the cloud. They would have thought you needed some help. You know what I mean, I think, when I say it exists in the cloud. It exists as ones and zeros on a computer somewhere. People are willing to die and to kill for things that only exist in cyberspace. Greed is very much out of control in the modern world, and it is idolatry. Paul says, because of these things, because of these, the wrath of God is coming. We know that we reap what we sow. Sin always has consequences. All of these things he's noted so far have a common theme. They all rebel against our Creator. They all rebel against the way that God would have things ordered. And they all put things in front of God. And so Paul says, because of these, the wrath of God is coming. We know, and we've seen the prophecies, we've read them about what is known as the great and dreadful day of the Lord. The prophets say that when that day comes, if God had not shortened its appointed time because of his mercy, no one would survive it. Hard to get the verbs right when we're talking about a prophecy in the past about something that takes place in the future, but stick with me. It will be a dreadful time, a time when the wrath of God is revealed. We know that God's wrath still pours out upon individuals from time to time, but it will be on that day something that has never been seen, something that puts to shame what happened at Sodom and Gomorrah, something that makes what happened to Egypt with the plagues pale by comparison. And it is coming. We do not know when that day will come. It might be this year, it might be 10,000 years from now, and either guess is as likely because we have absolutely no idea what it is coming. And humanity needs to reckon with that. If you do not live to see that day, you will stand before God just the same, and he will examine how you lived. Verse 7, you used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived. Notice, thankfully, that Paul puts this in the past tense for his readers, because he knows that they are no longer walking in these ways. They no longer live the life they once lived. By saying that they used to walk in these things, Paul says that you lived apart from God. Those things seemed to be normal to you. You would have said, what's the big deal about sexual immorality? What's the big deal about greed? You would have said the kinds of things that people say today. You might have said, my life, my body, my life, my decisions. It's my life, who are you to tell me what to do? Something of that effect. You might have thought he who dies with the most toys wins, or some variation thereof. They used to walk in those ways. They used to think like that. That was their life, because they didn't know God, because they didn't know that they had a purpose, that there was a plan for their life. They were not aware that they would answer to a judge one day. Paul says you used to live that way. But now, you must also rid yourself of all such things as these: anger, rage, malice, slander, and filthy language from your lips. Paul says you have been redeemed. Now, you need to rid yourself of even more. I think the first 5 in his list are fairly commonplace in the world, not just in our society today, but they're commonplace. They're often thought of as acceptable sins. Some societies don't have laws against these things. Some of them, if they have laws, they're not really overly punished. Think of prostitution as an example. An age-old example of sexual immorality, often illegal in many societies, but normally just winked at. Can't stop it. We'll arrest the blatant, obvious ones, but we're not going to worry about it. Paul says not only do you need to eliminate those, you need to eliminate also the things that are recognized as being detrimental to society. You need to get all of them, the common and the uncommon, the accepted and the unaccepted. They all need to go. You need to rid yourself of them. Just like he said before, put them to death. Now he says, rid yourself of them. You cannot afford to have a few cockroaches left. You cannot afford to have a few mice, a few other bacteria, whatever they are. You need to get rid of them because they'll come back otherwise. Consider yourself to be a recovering addict, whether that's an alcoholic or a heroin addict or a cocaine addict. You can't have a little bit. You can't have, if you are a recovering addict, a little bit in your life. You just can't. And so Paul says, rid yourself of these things. All such things that belong to your earthly nature need to go. Anger, rage, malice. Those three go together fairly well. They are as old a problem for humanity as Cain and Abel. That willingness on the part of human beings to harm other human beings in order to get their way. Can there be anything more antithetical to the servanthood that Jesus Christ has called us to than the willingness to cause harm to other human beings to get our way? Every piece of that is antithetical, is against being a disciple of Jesus Christ. We have no room for anger, rage, and malice. They are obviously a loss of self-control, and they lead to the kinds of actions which we cannot take back often, the kinds of actions that ruin our lives. Not only that, those passions, those emotions block you from forgiving. If you still have anger, how can you forgive? If you are raging and feeling malice towards someone, how could you possibly forgive them as you must? We cannot have these things in our hearts and in our minds. Paul says also your slander and filthy language. Literally in the Greek he says, get rid of your blasphemy, which is interesting because normally we think of blasphemy as something that can only be against God. But Paul here uses that same word to remind us of how dangerous our words can be. When you were a child, you probably said, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. You were, of course, lying, because they absolutely can destroy. How many children and teenagers do we need to see commit suicide because if they were being mocked and teased before we realize the danger of our words? And your mom said something that turned out to be true, whether you liked it or not when you were a kid. If you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all, which for many children would mean blissful quiet in the home, right? Especially if they've got 2 or 3 siblings. That might just mean you're not talking today, which the parents would not cry about. For what reason, if not a selfish reason, do we denigrate other people with our words? For what purpose, if not rebellion in our heart, do we use coarse and vulgar language? These things are not acceptable for the people of God. And then verse 9 is going to throw us a little bit of a curve at the beginning. Do not lie to each other, since you've taken off your old self with its practices. All the first things in the list, you're thinking rage, sexual immorality, filthy language, yeah, all that stuff. And then Paul says, don't lie to each other. You might be thinking, how does that fit on the list? I mean, lies. I mean, what kind of harm are we doing here? That absolutely belongs in this same list. Because we have been called to be a family. Notice Paul says, do not lie to each other. He didn't say that about the other stuff, right? He didn't say, get rid of your sexual immorality amongst each other, but if it's an outsider, that's okay. He didn't say, get rid of your rage against fellow Christians, but if it's an outsider, that's okay. But here, he specifically says, do not lie to each other. As a body of believers, as a family called together for a purpose, with a mission, how can we function if we don't have trust? How can we function? How can we cooperate without integrity? If you don't believe what I'm saying, I can't lead you. And you guys can't work together if you don't trust each other. If you're expecting that things that other Christians here in this body are telling you are lies, how could we possibly accomplish anything useful? We've got to get rid of this too. And now Paul gives us the explanation and some further understanding for this perspective. He says, since you've taken off your old self with its practices. This is a reminder, he's said this before. Our hearts and our minds can be set on heavenly things because we have taken off our old self. Not by our own power, of course, but by the work of Christ when we believed. That mortal blow to our sinful nature, to our earthly nature, whatever we're going to call it, to our flesh, that has been dealt by Christ. The Holy Spirit has empowered us to take off our old self, that part of us that was self-centered, that part of us that cared about ourselves as numero uno. We are no longer slaves to it. And with it go its practices, its actions, its attitudes, its behaviors go with it. All of the things that we did before, when we ourselves were the center of our own universe, there is an amazing amount of evil that is perpetuated in our world today by people keeping themselves at the center. We are no longer under its control, but instead we have put on the new self, which is being renewed in knowledge in the image of its creator. So instead of the old, we must put on the new. By the grace of God and the power of the Holy Spirit, we can do that. A new self that is oriented not to our will, but to the will of God. Not to our perspective and our values and our priorities, but to that of God. A perspective, a life that is willing to put God first, other people second, and ourselves third, which is, of course, the opposite of what it used to be. Because apart from God, we put ourselves first, other people somewhere in the list, and God not at all. We've got to flip that around completely. That is the new self, a self that is being renewed in knowledge. It is an ongoing process. It is a work in progress. We take out the old. We get rid of the trash and the filth and the nastiness that was there before and replace it with Christ-likeness. It's being renewed in knowledge. Because as we grow in our maturity as Christians, we realize how total this process needs to be, how deep and how thorough this transformation is. When we first come to Christ, we see the most obvious things, and we say, I'll get rid of this, we'll get rid of that, we'll get rid of that, and we've made great progress, and we feel good about that, and we should. But as we grow, as we mature, we notice other things. We realize there's more here. This is harder than I thought at the beginning. This is a lifelong process. And in the end, what we're aiming for is the image of our Creator. We have a blueprint. We have an example, of course, in Jesus Christ, in how we are supposed to live. And that will take us back to our original design. If you're going to fix what is wrong, what is broken, what has gone awry, who better to ask for help than the one that made it in the first place. When your car is not working, your often best bet is to go to someone who understands the manufacturing process in the beginning. Someone who knows this specific model and what its tendencies are. No one knows you like your Creator, and He is the one who knows what you are supposed to be. So let us return to our original intent. 3 quick thoughts to sum that up. Number 1, we certainly do need to eliminate not simply control, but eliminate those attitudes and actions that belong to our earthly nature. Secondly, in order to do that, we need to develop self-control. So many of those things Paul listed were our nature out of control. We need to prayerfully seek self-control. It is absolutely necessary for us. And thirdly, it's time for the old to go out and to be replaced with the new, which happens to be where we started from.